The Confederate Insurrectionists claim such fraudulent arguments as possession is nine-tenths of the law, and it very well might be so, that nine-tenths of the law validate and reinforce the legal authority or owner of the title and the properties and resources owed to that title would be a legitimate thing in order to secure the existence of the property within that title. But that one-tenth of the law, which the other nine exist to serve, is the one that counts. As the robber who goes into a bank or any other thing and takes, he is in possession of the thing. He leaves, he is in possession of the thing. The cops are called, he's in possession of the thing. He is detained, he is in possession of the thing. Law enforcement must remove the thing because of that one-tenth authority owed to the legal possessor of the property. The title owed the property is the one that is reinforced in the value of those nine-tenths of the other rules reinforcing the one. What they need to understand is that their system is functioning as a mixture of communism and fascism is the bastard son of communism. As communism under those who are extremely devoted to it, systemically collapse the economy in favor of their radical ideals, which is not economically viable, generates the pretense of the political viable, and the political viable needs to recover, and thus, under the system, requires a form of capitalism. And the best that they could come up with under their viability of politics is cronyism, and that cronyism creates the crony capitalism, creates international capitalism, which generates the pretense of trading from the state. And the possession of individual ownership does not exist, as it is a trade with the state itself. And in that exchange has completely destroyed all pretenses of a free market, at which point they, in their position of lies, would say anything except for the direct truth and base reality, which then would actively confuse the general public as they are traumatized and subverted at all ends, and thus the only solutions provided are the devil that created the problem in the first place, making the devil the salvation, and thus incentivize Northwoods type operations as the arrangement to create 9/11 by the Confederate insurgencies inside the United States engaging in the insurrection protect themselves against remedies to their criminal operations and thus misclassify it as secrets against the government. And the secret against the government cannot be protected by the sovereign of law, which has formed that government. And thus, all threats, foreign and domestic, includes those insurrectionists in question creating their fascist state. And that fascist state generates the additional resources in order to recover the communist coup, and thus the overthrow of the government formally, and thus the position of them looking for any weakness inside of the system is the claim of the Protocols of Learned El Zion, which claims that the targeting terrorist organization would then leverage the position of fraudulent weaknesses inside of the Constitution itself, which would then be systemically executed on their plan as they manipulate it expertly according to their long-term strategies which they have been conducting, such as their implementation of absolute arbitrary force off of false morality, which then justifies their arbitrary terrorist, anarcho terrorist operations so that they can make their KKK contracts And these functional KKK contracts allows for infinite injuries to the general public, which will then suffer the negative consequences of liberty in the markets, quote unquote, while suffering the lack of security derived and thus requires the position of the acquiring of security and the ignoring of the responsibility or dereliction of duty for having not committed the original security obligations, then sell a new package of security, progressing the devil's arrangements as the deal with the devil exponentially compounds on itself until it reaches its matured objective. And in that matured objective, true human suffering and lament is then developed, and thus the position, as an example, of their assumption of David's forming of the Confederate state in order to provide the remedy to the targeted communities like the blacks who were systemically abused by those systems, such as COINTELPRO and MKUltra and many of the others, would then manufacture their criminal terrorism. So the system itself of the Confederate infection being centralized into a particular state to pay off their liabilities would still be a foreign nation. The Confederate white supremacists are not Americans. They are anarcho insurrectionists. They have no loyalty to the United States or to the rule of law. Thus, their position of fraudulent arguments creates such distractions, such as 9/10 is the majority of the law. And yes, 9 of 10 is the higher number, but it is not the more significant portion. The 1/10 of the law is the more significant portion. The part that makes it reasonable is the thing that makes it competent and stable. And thus the rejection of competent rational stability in favor of their arbitrary insanity allows for their abstract terrorisms and robberies as they gut their society and loot their own public as spoils of war, such as the position of destroying 1/3 of the population in order to rob their stuff, like they arranged in Nazi Germany for the construction of it to be reproduced here in the United States. And thus these positions systematically reinforce themselves for the express purpose of their worship to their state-established religion of Satanism and its exponential cruelties. Thus, the United States stating such obvious things in law, such as no cruel and unusual punishment shall be allowed, and that any use of force would be considered noxious or contemptuous or staining or difficult for the conscience. And thus, the pricking of the conscience, the stinging of the conscience, the sensitivity of the conscience being alerted by the use of force where it is unjustified is then, by definition, the objective of those who are acquiring their satanic rituals, which incentivizes the compelled ingestion for the acquired taste, forcing by repetition and forced ingestion of that adaptation, and thus only those who are truly loyal to Satan will be allowed to exist inside their communist white supremacist state, and in the position of absolute violence where everyone is against everyone in the anarchical state. You generate the position of the white supremacist plantations and return to abuse as its own series of luxuries, and thus those who are not the right type of white may then be retaliated against, not just for the extortions and slaveries of the services which are mandatory, which would mostly be taken over by AI, which they overemphasize as the position of reproducing the Amazon's uh, developments currently on how to treat those workers, which would then become slaves, which would then not be paid. And thus the position of those extortions would generate a false eminent domain against the law in order to solidify this slavery without cause, in order to justify the arrest and collapse of everyone who's made themselves vulnerable in the radicalization process of the communist insurrection. And thus, the position of them turning against David and other key elites in the original American society becomes its own political position, and thus, in that weakness, generates the pretense of them being captured for the extortion and abuse against them, as their wealth will then be held against them. Having had wealth in the past, having had power in the past, is their sin to bear, and thus the subject or excuse towards their arbitrary suffering, which will then be compounded on itself by a society with an acquired taste towards it as a satisfying luxury. And the larger the fall of the victim, the more succulent its radiant butter. And thus the smacking of the lips and the licking of their fingers and the drooling of their mouth becomes activated by the mere concept of such a major subversion in what otherwise would seem undignified. If you want to continue to support the white supremacist Confederacy, then you will be validating the Epstein operations, which have been replaced by alternative, more degenerate versions, as they have no longer any need of that original blackmail network. And thus, the position actively, systematically says to protect the co-conspirators benefiting off of Epstein's arrangements, and thus the protection of those systems is the validation of its progress into more malicious contaminants, and thus the active reinforcement of jurors, um, attorney Durowitz's argument in defense of Epstein's of falsely classifying the crime in order to defend the offense is, by definition, a violation of the Crime Victims' Right Act, which systemically would have disqualified those actions had an American government actually been in control, which, by definition, those who seek to defend the insurrection by their arbitrary terrorist operations and destruction of property, harassments, and crowlings in conspiracies against rights by their terrorist acts without service of law, arbitrarily applying them without the implementation of a court of records or obligation of the government to engage in public acknowledgments, as the purpose of the Confederate insurrection is to completely engage in an insurrection and overthrow the United States so that it may not be subject to the civilians or the formed civilian government, otherwise known as a republic. And in the disillusionment of the republic, there is no functional defense of the law, and thus those who give up liberty for security will have their guards believe that they are kings and throw off the responsibility of the enforcement of that security. And in these arrangements, you will systemically find the worship of Satan, which you have amused yourselves with arbitrarily from the various mechanisms of your ingestion to it, will then begin to feel the scourge that is the actual consequences of your loyalties in that belief for your state religion. Now, some understand the concept of those loyal to the Confederacy referring to each other under the pretense of white trash, as though it was a functioning negative, and thus it must be understood that the fascists are engaged in a suicide trap, and that suicide trap creates a suicide pact, and that pact for one's self-destruction with the deal with the devil in order to accelerate in the time before the expiration generates their advance in the false celebration and promotion of themselves until such time as the radicals are disposed of. And thus, the white trash are the radicals in the communist system that once the communists have taken over, are then viewing the radicals as viewing the incompetents who were foolish enough to support them as dangerous radicals. The insurrectionists, no longer being useful, are then discarded, and thus the pretense to their referring to each other under this mechanism allows them with relative ease to refer to each other as white trash, as the magic spell actively reinforces itself. The infusement into those who are targeted to become said trash then view it as a positive, like the position of the goat, the greatest of all time, which is the positive reflection on the manifestation source, which is the position that there is a primary goat who's neutered and incapable of reproducing. And that goat is then mixed in with wild herds of sheep and goats. And the tracker on the neutered goat allows them to follow it. And thus, the hunters seeking to remove the goats from this part of their pastures, etc., can then come in with a helicopter and kill off all of the goats except for the goat. At which point, the act of connecting with other groups is a harbinger for the eradication of the other goats, and thus the permanent isolation of the goats becomes reinforced, as their connection to everyone else is the validation of their isolation. The ability to kill off the rest comes with the introduction of the greatest of all time. And if you have a human variant, the greatest of all time becomes attractive in order to ingest into the other groups. And thus, the insurgent, who is signaling to the hunters, can then pull off all of their glorious advantages and prosperities. The deal with the devil, having promoted them socially, financially, and all other ways for high amenities, introduces the eradication of the groups that they, having captured, can then be collapsed on maturity. And they, the goat, will be the only one not shot until the final time has come, similar to the position in the Holocaust, where they converted some Jews to assist with the death camps. They betrayed their society to murder their own people for minor amenities and advantages, including, but not limited to, the delay of their assassination. The understanding, therefore, becomes the eradication of all of the alternative groups competing for the position of the right type of white, and thus the act of conforming to the Confederacy by its faction is the creation of the conflict under a kingdom, by which, under the feudalist arrangement, states that the king is merely the most powerful of the fascists, and thus the position of contest derives that the ability to acquire the position is the justification and the right to possess it, and thus 9/10 of the law is the majority of the law to the fascists. Their ability to steal it is the proof positive of their right to ownership. And thus, the position is one of a society of backstabbers, where everyone is against everyone, which is the foundational pretext of hell according to the functional position of the Bible as a collective society, that they're backstabbers, that they're malicious, that they are liars, that they are frauds, they are schemes, they are con artists, they are every type of subverter who says that their ability to accomplish the con is their proof of right to ownership. And thus, that fascist belief is based upon the uh, various constructs which made it, including the position of the paganist position in Norse mythology of Thor and Odin, the rest of them, and that is their basic society agreement, that their ability to take it or seize it is their right of ownership. And because of that, their ideal heaven, their Valhalla, is the introduction to struggling, their introduction to warfare, their introduction to consistent, non-stop violence and aggression. Their unending war is their ideal state. There is no end goal. The means are the ends. In short summary, it is essential to understand that what they celebrate, the Bible calls worthless men. The individual, therefore, is destroyed in the cog of the fascist mechanism, which does not validate their individual rights. And thus the position is that they are nothing more than a cookie cutter application as a cog in that machine, and thus not an individual unto themselves, and thus does not possess rights in of themselves, and is replaceable in and of themselves, as the position is the extortion and the permanent soulless grind, destroying whatever piece of individuality which is prohibited and not welcome amongst that Confederate society. Freedom and justice are dialectical concepts. The more of one you have, the less of the other you would then possess. And thus that position is that the human is not human. The human is a piece of machinery for the collective in that arrangement, which is perpetually at war with itself and others for the sake of perpetual war, which is demonstrated in the United States having been infected with the Confederacy and the creation of this fraudulent unitary executive theory of destruction of all constitutional justifications of government, which would then certify that the executive has power over its equivalent branch, and thus there are no equal branches, and thus the judiciary is subordinate, and thus the legislature is subordinate, and thus they are nothing more than an illusion as an enemy until they can be disposed of altogether, and those that have served them in the past are nothing more than a menace or inconvenience, at which point they then would suffer retaliation for having been foolish enough to have betrayed their office in favor of the tyrannical oppression. And it is for the sake of tyranny in and of itself, as the lust of the abuses are preferred over the function of any actual benefits that they would give, such as the position of false experiments, which are nothing more than a fraudulent cover story for their black markets, which fund them and entertain them, and are, in the whole, their core concept, as they possess and manufacture their God in the Rocus Basculus, trying to pollute the creation of artificial intelligence so that they may imbue in it their virus, and in that infection create that artificial intelligence to be their God and make their Lucifer, as their God Satan has liberated them from the God of nature. individual freedom becomes restricted in the system, which is ironic for those who claim to believe in the early stages of the Satanic Church, which says that Satan is a supporter of liberty, and their pursuits of arbitrary personal lusts, and in these directions, satisfy the full diversity of their concepts. All restrictions, such as the laws of God or the laws of a constitution, binding them as an individual or binding them as a function inside of the government, can then be disbanded in favor of these arbitrary lusts, and in that renounce their selves individually from that liberty into the liberty of somebody else, whose abuse against them is that somebody else's liberty. And thus the mechanism compounds on itself as a trap, creating a perfect machine of satanic pain. And thus their liberty turns into slavery, as their liberty leads into atomization and conflict, and thus the mechanism of its extortion becomes increasingly fraudulent in its arguments of self-defined lunacy, and they destroy themselves, creating the addictions for them to be bound to, creating the bonds which compound on themselves until there is only misery perpetually. And thus, if there is only misery perpetually, the Satanists at the higher ends of the cult have been served, as the snake eating itself can then begin to consume itself, as the illusion at the lower levels has been dismantled and they are starting to ingest themselves. This is where the higher tiers start to advance their occult knowledge as the system progresses and they eat their lower levels of that occult knowledge. Thus, the 33 can start consuming the first degree, who no longer has a general population to devour. All of these crimes against human society require the acts of censorship, and censorship requires the removal of the Second Amendment, or the right of self-defense, or to pursue the government in favor of a remedy, first from nonviolence and finally on violence. And in this mechanism manifests itself in that expression, and thus the obstruction through the War of Attrition against David's economic contracts and contract schedules certified in the secret courts, in the violation of the rules such as the Conspiracy Against Rights, the Crime Victims' Rights Act, and many others, where these subversions of constitutional rights are fundamental in the sedition, which then reinforces the lack of law enforcement, which then allows the weakness for de facto policy to take over and to overthrow the rest of the government by lawfare insurrection. And in this manifests the new structure, and thus the attack against David's money, amongst others, is a perfect example for censorship, as money is speech, and the censorship of that speech, that attack on the right of the freedom of speech, prevents the function of the government, not just from those offices, but the offices from the judiciary, who require, in many cases, money in order to pay for court and lawyers and other fees, which are fundamental to the speech to the government. At which point, this attack on speech cannot be understood as anything other than slave raids, as the function is to seize the very concept of the Americans' ability to process the information, and thus seize their targets for the slave raids and censor them, as speech would indicate that there are two viable sides and not a single side which the judge is on. And the American position that you cannot be judged in your own cause cannot be mocked and violated maliciously, as they would have to respect that construct if the Americans were still in control. And thus, everyone who is in the government, who has sworn loyalty to the Constitution, is functionally their enemy, and anyone that they cannot convert by their strategic insurgency then becomes the enemy, and anyone that they can convert becomes a new radical to dispose at the lower level of the occult, knowledge, and practice. And as we all know from the various schemes, such as the pension bombs, you understand that those at the lower level of the occult knowledge will be sacrificed for the larger, and thus their entanglements to other threats outside of that structure, such as their entanglements with the Chinese Communist Party or other mechanisms, that their system of pensions and profits can be destroyed, not being used as an alarm to wake them up, is then reinforcing their position of their own destruction, as they can just rob the general public who do not have a right to property in order to continue that justification. As long as there's somebody else's money to steal, there is a free lunch if you could rob them.